Morning, everybody. Thanks for being here, and thanks to Rick and the AIC for inviting me to present. Yeah, we tend to steal our titles from our participants, so I can't even, take the thanks for that title. So this is a project, or the results of a project on firearms. So firearms are key to discussions of organised crime for a couple of key reasons. Firstly, because they're a commodity that is trafficked by organised crime groups, but also because they underpin or enable, as the theme of this session, other organised crime activities or illicit market activities. So I just want to be able to see the slides, so I'm going to stand a bit to the side. The motivation for this project was basically that there is a lot of research on organised crime. We've heard a lot of that research today and yesterday. A lot of research has been done in the space of organised crime on criminal groups and on illicit markets, but there's really been limited research on the specific issue of firearms crime and firearms trafficking and the use of illicit firearms in illicit markets and in organised crime contexts. So the focus of this presentation is twofold. Firstly, it's about the acquisition of firearms by members of organised crime groups or affiliates of organised crime groups. But it's also about how affiliates of organised crime groups utilise firearms to enable other types of activities, to enable illicit market activities, and to enable other types of what we might package as organised crime activities more broadly. I'm going to focus more on the second than the first. This is part of a preventing firearm crime study that we conducted many years ago now. The interviews were conducted between about 2017 and 2018-19. It was an interview-based study. We went into prisons in New South Wales and South Australia, and we interviewed men who had long histories of firearms crime of various sorts. I could probably spend the entire presentation just telling you about the challenges of that study and the processes we had to go through and the challenges of recruitment, but I'm not going to do that. If there are questions afterwards, I'm happy to talk a bit more about that and expand on some of those challenges. We focused at the get-go on three primary groups. We wanted to talk with individuals who had histories of drug trafficking and who used firearms within the context of those activities. We wanted to talk to members of gangs or organised crime groups, for example, outlaw motorcycle gang members who had histories of firearms crime. And we wanted to talk to individuals who had histories of armed robbery. We figured they were kind of the key three groups that we really wanted to talk to. Now, obviously, they overlap quite a bit, and they did in practice. In this presentation, I'm focusing on the first two of those groups, in the context of organised crime groups. The project fits within the tradition of qualitative approaches to organised crime, interviews, deep, rich interviews with individuals who have experience in these contexts. This was the first of its kind in this country, and I think still the only one of its kind in this country, interviews with individuals who have long histories of firearms crime, and one of only a few internationally. It was funded by the Australian Research Council, so I'm very grateful to the ARC for funding this project. Very briefly, want to just give an overview of how individuals in illicit markets, the illicit firearm markets, get access to illicit firearms. This is based on a paper that came out in 2023. I'll provide more details about the publications at the conclusion for those who are interested in accessing those. So these were the primary thematic areas that came out around acquisition of firearms from the interviews. Firstly, and not really surprisingly, there's been quite a bit of work here in Australia and elsewhere around this issue, theft of firearms, particularly from rural areas, from rural properties. Many of the individuals we spoke to accessed their firearms by committing break-ins on rural properties and stealing firearms. But secondly, and Ed set this up really nicely in his presentation earlier, the contribution of social networks or criminal networks, trusted, tight networks in which individuals can access firearms through their social ties or their trusted ties. Related to that was the dynamic of vouching or brokerage, so individuals getting access to firearms via other people who were trusted contacts. So if an individual wanted to access a firearm and didn't necessarily know the right person to go to, they might know a person who would know a person who was the right person to go to, and there was quite a lot of that kind of dynamic reported by the interviewees. We were interested to ask many of our interviewees about the timeframes in which they could get access to firearms, and this speaks to the value of social networks and tight, trusted networks. Individuals that we spoke to told us they could get firearms very quickly, within hours, within days, depending on the type of firearm they wanted to access. We were told by a number of our interviewees about caching or stockpiling of firearms, and I'll come back to that a bit later. Many of the individuals we spoke to also talked about the risks of being involved with illicit firearms markets, and in particular, concerns about being held responsible for the criminal histories of firearms that they might be caught with. In other words, firearms are durable commodities. They can circulate in illicit markets for many, many years, decades, and individuals who are caught with a firearm concern that they would be held responsible for firearms crimes that they may not have been actually responsible for, but were connected to the firearm. So now moving to the sort of primary focus of the talk today, and that is the drivers or the motivations for individuals to carry around a firearm, to display that firearm in public, or to discharge that firearm in different contexts. And the themes that were revealed in our analysis are these: power, status and reputation. I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. Protection, particularly in the drug trade. Intergroup conflict, often within illicit market contexts or business contexts, but sometimes just personal fallings out or personal arguments. Arms races between groups. Robbing drug dealers was one of the key contexts in which firearms are used for debt collection and used for retribution. So I'll just go through each of these individually, and for each of them I'll be just putting up some quotes from some of our participants. A trigger warning, not for that pun, but there will be some strong language on the screen and some descriptions of violence. I'm not going to read them out, but there will be some pretty strong swear words on the screen. We think it's important to report what our participants said in full rather than censoring it. So with respect to power, status and reputation, sometimes this was instrumental power or strength, where people were trying to basically tip the balance in their favour in the context of rivalry or conflict. And you'll see on the screen a couple of examples where individuals felt like they maybe didn't have the physical attributes to be competitive in conflicts, but that firearms could sort of tip the balance in their favour and give them the edge that they needed. So instrumental, but also symbolic. So firearms were used by many of the guys that we spoke to facilitate reputation, to give themselves status within these groups. And as you'll see from that last quote, a sense of identity. So a lot of the guys we spoke to attributed much of their identity to their position in these groups, to their reputation within these groups, and firearms were a big part of garnering that reputation and that status. Many of the guys we spoke to were involved in the drug trade, and the use of firearms as a means of protection in that trade was a primary motivation or a primary reason for carrying firearms. In particular, handguns as a type of firearm that's easily concealable. They could be taken to deals, taken into contexts where they felt as though they would need some kind of protection. They may not display it in that context, but they would feel better that they had the firearm, that if they needed it, if things got real, if things turned into a conflict, that they would have the firearm in order to protect themselves. And the main concern here was being ripped off, either having money or drugs stolen in the context of purchasing or selling drugs. Some of the individuals, for example, participant 61, talked about guns as just a tool of the trade. That, some trades need tools, and guns are kind of the tool of our trade. But much of this was based on the fear of being ripped off, or the fear of being assaulted or harmed in some way, and that firearms just gave them a sense of of not being as fearful. Many of the individuals we spoke to talked about conflict between groups. Sometimes this was related to business, so business deals that had gone sour, or business relationships that had gone sour, perhaps individuals being owed money, or the drugs don't turn up when they're promised. But often these were personal disputes, and Ed, I know, talked about this in his talk this morning as well, where some of these disputes are about business, but many of them are just about personal vendettas and personal disagreements. Sometimes we had individuals talking about drive-by shootings, so attempts to intimidate other individuals or other groups through the use of firearms. But often there were reports of actual kind of shootouts between groups. We know that these kinds of public shootings have happened, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne and other places, and firearms being used as a means to deal with these kinds of conflicts, these intergroup conflicts. Related to that was a sense of there being an arms race between groups that were in competition or conflict, and the need to collect firearms in order to have an armoury that would be competitive against other groups that were ostensibly doing the same thing. And this is kind of where the criminal networks or the social networks work in a slightly different way. They can facilitate access to firearms, but they can also facilitate this kind of process of rumour around other groups having large numbers of guns, and therefore, our group needs to develop an armoury in order to be competitive should things get more serious. So some of the guys we spoke to talked about groups having an armoury, collecting together a large number of firearms. And this was not just about number of firearms, but it was also about types of firearms. So in these contexts, high calibre machine guns, automatic weapons were the kinds of firearms that were being sought out and potentially to be utilised in these kinds of conflicts between different groups. The other context we heard quite a lot about, and this is sort of the inverse of the protection theme that I've already discussed, individuals needing firearms to protect themselves from the potential of being ripped off. We had a number of guys tell us about their role in actually engaging in these kinds of rip-offs or stealing from drug dealers. So if you know that someone is a wholesale drug dealer, they've probably got a lot of drugs somewhere and possibly a lot of money, and that one could simply use a firearm to go in and steal the drugs or the money. Some of the individuals we spoke to, for example, participant 36, took a kind of, thought this was sort of a low act, that it was just kind of an easy way of doing business rather than doing the hard yards, getting a connect in the drug business and dealing drugs in a market, but simply going in and stealing the drugs or stealing money. And participant 35 described a situation where he would actually use a firearm to go in and steal money from either retail level drug dealers, so sort of, I guess, lower level drug dealers, smaller amounts of drugs, smaller amounts of money, but also higher level drug dealers, so wholesale level drug dealers, where the take in both drugs and money would potentially be higher. And firearms being a key part of this process. Just to add to that, and with respect to preferences for different types of firearms, so in this case, the types of firearms that would be preferred were shotguns or sawed-off shotguns as being a type of firearm that would intimidate in these contexts. I remember one of the guys we spoke to told us that nothing gets a man's attention like a shotgun. So the preferences for firearms were sort of a key sort of part of the dynamic here. Firearms used for debt collection, so where debts are not paid, firearms being deployed to either threaten individuals to pay those debts or to engage in retribution if those debts are not paid, and this one here is an example of use of a handgun to threaten a drug dealer who hadn't paid a debt, and in the end, because the person tried to escape or run away, was shot. And then finally, retribution. So this can be, again, retribution for business deals that have gone bad, or it can be retribution for a kind of social rivalry or social arguments, interpersonal arguments or interpersonal disputes. And we've seen that quite a bit more recently, but many of the guys we spoke to talked about this. And this could be using a firearm to injure another person in order to punish that person for failing to pay debts or whatever it might be, or as we've seen, tit-for-tat type shootings between rival groups, or it might be actually murdering somebody who hasn't paid a debt or is being punished for some other indiscretion. So a few observations just to finish up, and then I'll just talk a bit about the implications for policy and practice. So first of all, if we take, from a criminological perspective, if we take a very sort of rational actor perspective on this, we can see that individuals who are using firearms in illicit markets or in organised crime contexts are weighing risks and rewards at some level. They're weighing the risks of not carrying a firearm in particular contexts. So carrying a firearm means that they can tip the balance in their favour, as I've said earlier, versus the rewards of doing so, but also the risks of being caught with a firearm and potentially the punishment that might go along with that, the criminal justice punishment that might go along with that. More broadly, if we take more of a network perspective or social dynamics perspective, we can see the importance of social ties, of social embeddedness, of relationships, the notion of resource pooling of firearms being available to a broader group of individuals, but also that firearms as a durable commodity can circulate within a social network or criminal network over many, many years, being used by multiple people for different types of criminal activities. But beyond that, there's an important symbolic value of firearms in criminal milieu and subcultures. The value of having a firearm, the identity of carrying a firearm, different types of firearms play into the symbolic value as well. So the symbolic value around obtaining a reputation and retaining that reputation as being a kind of hard man are really key components of the use of firearms. And then we know that the arms race is also a significant factor, not just around numbers of firearms, but also around types of firearms, and the notion that one wants to sort of outgun one's opponents or one's rivals. We know that the need for protection is a particular dynamic here, particularly the use of handguns in the context of illicit drug transactions. And relatedly, there's this clear nexus between illicit drug markets and the use of firearms. But more broadly, and as we've seen more recently, expanding into other types of illicit markets, such as the illicit tobacco market. And I've sort of touched a little bit on the preferences for different types of firearms for different types of purposes. So just finishing up now and just covering off on just a few implications, and I'm going to do this briefly, but obviously happy to expand during question time. So first of all, it's clear that there is a need to reduce the availability of firearms. We know that one of the big ways that individuals get access to firearms is through thefts. A lot of firearms are being held by individuals where those firearms are not licensed, so they basically disappear from recording, but they're sitting in individuals' homes, in rural properties. They were not handed back as part of some of the buyback processes that we've had in Australia over many years. So there's a need to reduce the availability of those firearms, number one. There needs to be focused attention on key brokers, key facilitators, individuals who perhaps are caching firearms, illicit firearms, and who are brokering these kinds of deals. If you want to get bang for your buck in the criminal network space, targeting brokers is a key way to do that. We need to reduce the attraction of organised crime. It's easy to say that, but there is a need to reduce the attraction of organised crime and firearms crime, particularly for young men who see it as a way to improve their standings, improve their status, and a way to perhaps find a way forward in their lives. Relatedly, we need to look at the range of drivers for being involved in organised crime, and that's not just economic drivers. It's about relational drivers and affective drivers as well, the symbolic reasons that individuals might want to get involved in organised crime. And we also need to facilitate desistance from organised crime. And there's a number of ways we can do that, but we're not doing it particularly well currently. So we need to provide individuals ways and methods to actually desist from organised crime. And finally, we need to enhance data collection and data analysis. We don't do a good job of keeping track of numbers of firearms, stolen firearms. Much of that data is not publicly available, and I think it should be. The Australia Institute has recently published a couple of reports that look at both legally owned firearms but also thefts of firearms, and I think those reports speak to the need for better data collection and better data analysis and more research. So that's it. I'm just going to flash up a couple of the papers that we've published. There are QR codes if anybody can be bothered scanning those. So one of these was about the acquisition of firearms. The one on the left, the one on the right is more about the use of firearms around obtaining and retaining criminal status in these contexts. And finally, the presentation I gave today was actually a chapter from an edited collection that came out last year. If you're interested, again, QR code. And that book covered a range of different aspects of illicit firearms markets. So 2 parts to the book. The first part is about regional perspectives on illicit firearms markets across the world. The second part of the book covers off on emerging risks or threats within illicit firearms contexts. For example, 3D printed firearms and the nexus between illicit firearms markets and terrorism. That's it. Thanks very much.